Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our KuppingerCole webinar, Onboarding Your Business Partners to Your Services, B2B Identity Management or IAM in Practice. This webinar is supported by iWelcome. The speakers today are Marco Venuti, who is Vice President Product Management at iWelcome, and me, Martin Kuppinger. I'm co-founder and principal analyst at KuppingerCole. Before we start and dive into the topic, some quick information about KuppingerCole and some housekeeping information. KuppingerCole is an independent global analyst company. We're delivering a variety of services such as executive view reports, leadership compasses, webinars and conferences, but also advisory services around identity and access, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. We have a number of different research formats such as our leadership compass, where we compare vendors and the offerings in certain market segments, our executive views focusing on individual products and services, advisory notes and leadership briefs for the background information and the information you need for decision support. In advisory, we support you in creating your strategy, defining your portfolios, selecting the right type of technology, and in some areas of running a project. What we don't do is we don't do any implementation work. We just support you on sort of the neutral end, defining a portfolio, selecting the right technology, etc. We have various events we run. So currently or upcoming, we have a couple of events around cybersecurity, around identity. In Berlin, we have an AI event later this year in November, and we have consumer identity event, which will run next week the week after next week in Amsterdam. So various events coming up. Have a look at our website, which events we will have and what we are doing here. For the webinar itself, you are muted centrally. We are controlling these features, so you don't need to mute or unmute yourself. We are recording the webinar and will make the podcast available short term, and also will provide the slide decks for download. And there will be a Q&A session by the end of the webinar. However, you can enter questions at any time, and obviously the more questions we receive during the webinar, the better it is, because we then can have an interesting Q&A by the end of the webinar. For the agenda of today, we split this into three parts. The first part is that we look at the differences between various use cases for managing identities. So from B2E to B2B to B2C, and we look at the high-level requirements for B2B identity management. That will be the part I will do more as the introduction, so the umbrella for the topic of this webinar. In the second part, then Marco Venuti of iWelcome will dive much more into detail and look at the very detail of B2B IAM in practice and how to solve the specific challenges best. The third part then will be our Q&A session. So when we look at the topic of B2B IAM, I want to start with what is the job of IAM itself. So what is it why we really need identity and access management? Basically, the job of identity management is connect everyone to every service. And we see that this is to some extent more coming together, overlapping, so specifically B2B and B2C, sometimes also B2E to B2B use cases. Factually, all of these have something similar, and all of these have something which makes them different. And when we talk about everyone, and maybe even everything to extend that, we talk not only about employees or consumers. A very important group are business partners, which again have a variety, or we have a variety of different types of business partners, which can be contractors, which can be your suppliers, and many others. So there are very different types of business partners with specific requirements on identity and access. And all of these users need access to some of your services, obviously not all, and only controlled and limited access, but they might need access to some of your cloud servers, to some of your services which are still running on premises, supporting federation technology, or where you federate out to others, and to your legacy applications. So we need to connect this. We also will observe when we look at this more in detail, these have different identity providers. The consumers might come in with their own identity. So bring your own identity. They might rely on external identity providers, starting with a social login. Business partners might federate in. So when you work with large suppliers, it might be that you build on identity federation. You might build your own repositories for partners in certain instances based on an identity API platform. The employees on the other hand, might be still managed in your internal directory services, your Active Directory, your LDAP, whatever. What we clearly see is that there's a broader number of these IDPs, so it doesn't make it simpler. And then we federate out to the cloud, or we have an API-based access. We do it with the applications that support federation standards. We might use more traditional technologies such as Web Single Sign-On or APIs to connect to our legacy applications. And we need to build something in between which provides the access management capabilities, the administration and governance for identities, and additional capabilities such as consent, privacy, and more. From a logical perspective, this is sort of a set of services which commonly is deployed through multiple tools. So there's not the single tool, but it's a set of services which enable you to connect all these identities to all these services. We at KuppingerCole, we call this an identity fabric, and so there's more and more research provided by us available around this topic. This also relates to when we look at B2B identity and other types of identity management, also to sort of the evolution of identity. To do this very, very quickly, we started way ago with managing users per system. We added then identity management some 25, 30 years ago, maybe sometimes even a little more, but we started synchronizing accounts between systems where we initially had things like a meta directory service, stuff like that, and provisioning came into play. But the focus was very much on employee identities. We then had the first touch point to business partners with federation, which primarily was more between bigger business partners. So you had a large supplier, a large automotive vendor here, federate identity so that you don't need to manage all these employees of the supplier at the automotive vendor, stuff like that. We had the first standard protocols. We also saw these types of technologies and standards becoming then adopted by cloud services for single sign-on. Over the past couple of years, we saw more and more uptake of consumer identity management. So from the B2E to some B2B to B2C. And right now we see that this becomes more and more a mixed picture. So where we have the same approaches, sometimes also bring your own identity or external identity providers, which are shared. We see also the trend to sharing and reusing KYC information, so know your customer, to the formal onboarding processes with strong regulatory requirements. So we see this shift, and we see also some convergence between such use cases, but we also see the specifics. And when we look at the specifics, and I know that Marco will have a slide which also looks at this with some overlap and some extensions. But if you look at these specific identities of these various groups, so we have the consumers, we have the partners, we have the employees, or we have B2C, B2B, B2E. How do these things look like? When we look at consumers and registration, then for consumers, registration is very frequently a self-servicing. You notice all from your daily life in the internet, so to speak, when you register with here is a service, there was a service. Unfortunately, it is very frequently re-registering again and again, so little reuse of identities. This is happening sometimes with specific KYC processes. So when you go to a telco, when you go to a bank or others, then registration needs to comply with regulations. And then we are talking about these specific KYC processes. We have a pretty simple concept of big quotas here of roles or whichever construct you want to use to group consumers. So there are simple and usually a very few different types of bundlings of entitlements or groups of consumers you have. We say, okay, these can do that or that. What you commonly have is sort of an orthogonal aspect, which means that Martin Kuppinger is only allowed to see his orders, his invoices, and all the other stuff. So that is something where you don't limit it. You say every customer is allowed to see his invoices, but but only his. And so these are things, but the concept is relatively simple compared to the complexity we see in the employee environment frequently. So deprovisioning for consumers, it honestly rarely happens. So if you register somewhere and you don't order goods anymore from there, at some time you might be deleted or your account just remains there, but that's it. What is the focus? The primary focus here is really enabling flexible authentication, supporting all the different IDPs more and more, so not requiring the people to re-register again for the service, but to work with external IDPs. Make it easy, make it simple. For partners, it looks fairly different. So the registration is in an ideal world managed by the business partner via federation. So the supplier already has a system where he has his employees in, where their roles are in some way, what are they doing, and he could federate it out. So they authenticate at a business partner and you trust him, and if that person still has that job, you allow him to do certain things. Doesn't work always. Factually, in many cases, it doesn't work that way. So you might build your own solution for business partners, your own IDP, or you might rely on other types of registration, also some self-registration stuff, etc. This gets more granular because you might then have people from different suppliers being allowed to do different things because they're depending on the business process, the business relationship, the differs, but it's by far usually not as sophisticated as it is for employees when we look at the granularity of entitlement management. One of the big challenges in here is obviously the deprovisioning. It must be done by the partner, at least the information must come from the partner. Oh, Martin doesn't have the job anymore, or Martin doesn't work at my company anymore, which frequently fails. But it is critical capability. So this must work well. Obviously, you could argue if the person can't authenticate with the business partner anymore, safe side, but not necessarily, because the person might just have a different job, and then you still have an issue. So managing this is clearly one of the interesting things in B2B identity management. So focus, enable federation, ensure proper on and offboarding, remain flexible, and support different scenarios. So I talked about suppliers, but you also have your contractors. Contractors are frequently more managed by someone in your organization. So it's a different thing than federating with a business partner. You might also have the need for some low-level KYC processes. So one of the things is when I look at the security people in an organization, which frequently are outsourced. In many cases, they always use the same account because there's a lot of change amongst these people. So they're frequently, there are a lot of different people coming in and out, and the processes don't work well. But specifically for something like that, you need to have well-working processes where everyone is managed properly and has his own identity, because it's about security. So looking at employees, again, a different picture. There is registration is frequently automated, sometimes partially managed, happens from the HR system or systems like that. The roles and entitlement models are frequently rather complex, and honestly, very, very frequently overly complex. So many organizations make it far too complex, the role models. Some pragmatism and some good human sense definitely helps here. So don't make it too complex, but it is more complex in the other areas because you go into far more detail, you have more granularity, a lot of different things to do in your organization. Deprovisioning still commonly is cumbersome. Commonly less automated as registration, but it obviously is mandatory. So again, something you need to solve. Focus is increasingly shifting to the access management piece. So beyond just managing the entitlements and reviewing the entitlements, how can you give also your employees a convenient access? So for consumers, tendency is self-service. Partners delegated either to the partner or to someone in your organization, sometimes also self-service. So it's a wilder mix. So it might be managed, delegated self-service for the partner, while employees and consumers usually have a very clear approach, either self-service or managed. But there are similarities. What is common across all? We're talking about identities and accounts. These identities are converging, and identity management is also converging. So we see more overlap between the use cases. Enable access of everyone, like I've already told, to everything in a controlled manner. We need to look at privacy and consent in each of these cases. GDPR applies to everyone. Contracts might help for employees, probably will. For partners, they might help or not, but it must not be ignored. We must look at it. Delegation is something we have. So managers manage their team members, project manager manage their members of the project team, partners manage their employees, sales team might manage customers, customers might manage family or team members. So we have a need for delegation. And that is something which is, I would say, one of the not that well solved areas in most IAM solutions these days. But in some it is quite well solved. And we have authentication, authorization. At the end, it's all about access. You need to manage access well. That is the essential thing here. What are the main requirements for doing B2B IAM right? So think beyond B2B. So I think you shouldn't end up, I recommend, I'm convinced you shouldn't end up with a B2B identity management, a B2C identity management, and a B2E identity management all separate from each other. That doesn't make sense. It's looking at all areas of identity management. It's far more than IGA, or so it's PAM, it's identity federation and other stuff. So look at it from what all does it need to do it right. Have an access focus on access management, but also access governance. So control access. At the end, that is the important thing to manage. Be flexible regarding the models. There are multiple models for self-service, for delegation, specifically around partners. And specifically for this area, for B2B identity management, you need to cover a broad range of approaches because there's not the one partner. And finally, do it comprehensive. It's easy to onboard someone. It's more complex to offboard. Define the process at both the organization level and the individual level well. So avoid risks by spending time on processes. That is, so from my end, the overview of what I think is very important for a well-working B2B identity management, which is more than just B2B identity management, which always needs to be part of your overall identity management approach. With that, let me hand over to Marco, who right now will go more in detail to talk about our details in practice. Marco, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you all for joining us today. And in the next 20 or 25 minutes, I would like to go through a very short agenda for today, which is a bit of an intro and recap of previous episodes that we shared before around a similar subject, and then to share some case studies, some real world scenario that we had the opportunity to address over the last couple of years, trying to identify commonality and diversity, and then look at what was the approach in terms of solution case study, in terms of design principle and logical architecture. That will lead us to conclusion and to Q&A. As I said before, this is the second episode of a conversation that started back in May around similar subject, which is B2B and B2C. And I'm assuming for the purpose of today's conversation that most of you haven't attended that session. So to some extent, a few slides will be a repetition. Apologies for those who actually attended that before. But again, it was back in May, so it's already 5 months ago. But again, the subject is so broad, there are so many things to share that we decided to split what we have to say and what we would like to share with you into 2 different episodes. So for today's session, the key question that I would like to address are really about what are the typical scenario like. So what defines B2B? Why is that different? What kind of challenge is that defined by, and what are the core needs in terms of technology? And talking technology, which adoption pattern have you assisted over time? So hopefully this is meaningful for you. And again, picking back from what Martin just introduced in these very nice slides around the distinction between workforce B2B and B2C, I would like, again, to extend from that, introducing what I call the identity paradox that we assist these days. Because again, we have workforce identity, which has been there for a while now, and is definitely served by well-established solution already. Opposed, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have the consumer one, much more recent, but still also, yet also very well defined. And this in-between space, which depending on the specific case, is closer to the workforce one or more often to the consumer one in terms of needs. But all in all, it means, what this means is that we still have these days a very clear distinction between pure workforce or consumer solution out there in terms of market offering. But at the same time, there is no such a thing as a single solution that spans thoroughly the entire spectrum. So you cannot just pick a single product expecting it to be able to properly tackle the workforce all the way to the consumer use cases. And that's not a big problem if it wasn't that hybrid or in-between scenario are increasingly frequent, if not the norm already. So that defines what I call a bit of an interesting mix of combination of statement, because again, it poses a challenge about picking the right solution for the job, depending on the use cases you need to tackle. So when is usually B2B identity management involved? So what are the circumstances in terms of business context that define B2B? So first of all is whenever we have the pleasure to address a customer where the identity are not originated into an HR. So they are beyond what I call the HR demarcation line. They manage people which are coming from other sources, but definitely not from an HR system. Maybe, and very often, they are in a transition. They are rebuilding or replacing one of the core business, one of the core applications to manage their core business. Maybe because they are in the transition as well from on-prem and cloud, but that becomes part of it. And they enter a conversation which is more of an architectural conversation, because what they are looking for is, the business application they want to rebuild is not coming as a pre-packed application from one vendor out there. There is no such a thing as a pret-a-porter solution for this, but they need to build it, or at least to customize significantly an existing solution. So again, it becomes very much an architectural conversation, which brings to the quest for the right combination, the right shade of make versus buy of the various components now part of that architecture, of course, to avoid to reinvent any of the wheels that are building the entire machine. So that is a bit of a context on when B2B kicks in. Okay, most important one, of course, treating identity which are not coming from the HR. So let's look at a few examples of customers, anonymized here, that we had the pleasure to address in Europe over the last couple of years. So case number one is from Germany. It's a manufacturing company. They build equipment, they build machines in the food and beverage segment, such as vending machine, for instance, and they have a large network of reseller, distributors, and field services company they have a business relationship with, for obvious reasons. The business need they have is to manage the access delegation on the entire distribution and service chain for billing for the billing associated to the machine operation and for the maintenance reasons. In terms of technical requirement, they need to manage flexibly the coarse grain and fine grain authorization on user and device. Device as well were involved here, so there's an IoT dimension in this customer case, but that's beyond the purpose of today's conversation. It really was around managing coarse grain, meaning who should get access to what, and fine grain, which was also about which device should be visible to whom. Okay, that was the combination of challenges they were looking at. Another interesting case is from a banking sector. In this case, in Italy, is a mid-sized bank that was starting a new initiative on the real estate market, selling mortgages and insurance contracts specifically for the real estate, but in a pure B2B approach. They don't address directly the retail customer, they just onboard and manage the relationship with dealers, actually in a two-pronged approach. Some dealers are onboarded directly by the main bank. Some others are coming in through partner banks, banks not belonging to the same group, but still belonging to the same market offering. So in that case, they need to manage the delegation piece, but also the consent related to these onboarding processes, while still retaining centrally the ability to tweak what is the level of access delivered through to those dealers downstream. Technically speaking, they needed to have an identity, a central identity repository for again identity and access, and also the coarse grain and consent. Let's look at the third example, different industry, different countries, still in Europe, but this time an insurance company, fairly large one, with a full spectrum of product, ranging from life, car, home, damages, etc., and addressing both business and retail customer. And as very often is the case for insurance company, with a wide network of agents and brokers. In this case, the business need was to totally offload the access management piece to the broker and to the agents. Technically speaking, they were really hoping for introducing a sustainable single sign-on across the multitude, significant number of applications they need to provide to those parties, and to authorize differently, coarse grain, again, the various types of users. So those are just scenario of existing customer, which are by definition very much B2B, or if not purely B2B. But it's also the case more and more that we assist to customers which are not yet our customer, coming to us with RFI and RFP, with more frequently than before, are featuring requirements around managing multiple layers of users, different types of users, to dedicated registration processes and validation mechanism. So those are very much the signature of what B2B is about these days. That's where a significant part of the requirement are landing. I'm keeping it coarse grain here, okay, but we can get to a much more finer grain set of requirement in that space. So in general, what are the key things that I can derive from what I just shared with you in terms of use, in terms of scenario? Feels like that the most common problem are, of course, and that's a very traditional one, around improving what otherwise is a fragmented online experience, providing single sign-on and removing the need for traditional multiple password required to get in, and providing at the same time a source of truth for identity and access. But then there is an increasing request for having a central ledger for consent and preferences, because again, employees of other companies such as business partner are not bound to the same level of contract that employees are subject to, which means that they need to express their consent, okay, which is not the case usually for employees. And finally, there is the management overloading piece. So how do I offload the overwhelming effort of managing who can do what on those companies that I'm now working with? How do I make that decentralized? So those are really the common problems. So from traditional aspects such as providing single sign-on to delegation, I would call it delegation of authority, not to confuse delegation as I go on holiday and I want to delegate my colleague. So this is delegation of authority that we're talking about here. That being said, when it comes to build and look at this architecture, again, is very often an architectural conversation. What are the core components, the wheels that we don't want to reinvent, okay, that are defining that architecture when it comes to the identity side of the solution? Well, trying to enumerate the core bullets that defines that, the core wheels, the first one is for sure the core identity capability, which have to do with authentication, federation, single sign-on. That's where protocol compliance is also in, right? The SAML, the OAuth, the OIDC. Well, nobody's really reinventing that wheel, right? There's such a broad market offering out there of both on-prem or a cloud solution with an API only or an API plus UI strategy that most of the customer I had the pleasure to work with are really getting one of those solutions rather than rebuilding it themselves, okay? I think I hardly ever assisted to anybody venturing in that space because it's overwhelming to keep up with the constantly evolving standard. And again, you need to really have a very solid business case to go there. Second bullet, a bit more interesting, which is the interaction orchestration. That's where the registration, the validation, the activation process flows are, and also the consent lifecycle management and preference management. That's where the diversity is peaking. Really, one customer is not really looking like another one at all, right? And you have also other aspects that are kicking in, such as multi-branding, okay? Meaning the same customer having different skins depending on the business line. Now, in this very aspect around the interaction orchestration, there is a big distinction between B2B and B2C, because in business to consumer, usually you have a very high level of attention on the brand identity. You want a so-called pixel perfect rendering on the way you represent your company out there to consumer, which leads most of the time to custom UI building. You start from the API and you build the UI leveraging those API to serve the identity needs. B2B is different. You have not the same sense of perfection, okay, in terms of representing the brand identity, which means that you're very open, much more open in leveraging existing built-in user out-of-the-box user interfaces, user experience for business users. And that goes without saying, significantly speeds up the time to value that you can get out of a solution. So for that reason, the inclination of going by versus going API first is very high, okay, in interaction orchestration. Third domain, authorization management and authority, delegation of authority, okay? Those two things could well be and should probably be two separate bullets. I combine them into a single one because to some extent they are addressed pretty much the same way in my experience, although they are different things. Again, authorization is around relying coarse-grained authorization on application, okay? So it's about not necessarily identity specific, it's really business application specific, while delegation of authority is around managing other people access and managing other people to become themselves manager of other people. So downstream chains of delegation, right? Those two things are very much B2B related. And again, you find in market solution rather than building them an answer which is significantly improving your ability to reach an optimal time to value. Right on the opposite side of the spectrum, to conclude my enumeration here, is the fine-grained authorization management, which is very much in the guts of the very specific business application the company we had the pleasure to work with were building, and is very hard to abstract. And that's where we need to draw the line and to have a conversation with our customer to understand where we stop with the coarse grain and where the fine grain kicks in, okay? Fine grain can be at times served with authorization service technology, but very often, again, is just built into the application they are now reviewing. So that being said, maybe let's have a quick look in a visual fashion of one of those use cases. I'll take the insurance one, which was the third I presented before, in the way it looked. So in that case, again, it was one company group, but actually made of two legal entities. One is proper insurance, another one is a road assistance service. And the insurance one is representing itself to the consumer with different brands, different skin, okay, along the line of different products. this insure group is a fictional name, right, to anonymize the use case, but it reflects reality in this customer we had the pleasure to serve. So what they were having, again, according to the way we deployed the solution, was, well, we look at these two companies as two different, by all means, domains, so they should treat user differently. So the same person should register independently if they join one of the three brands of the insurance or if they join Road Health. Okay. Of course, between the two groups, there's a federation in place, but they are registered independently. Okay. And apart from that, you will want to, in this case again, serve both the consumer with different brands, and there might be different experiences associated to the different brands. We will look at that in a minute. And of course, we have business users, which are provided with a totally different set of capability, goes without saying, specifically the access to the various business applications they need to have and the delegated authority delegation capability. So let's have a look of what it looks like in terms of, well, high-level architecture. So consumer, rather than going straight into the portal of the two companies, are provided with dedicated experience for registration, authentication, and consent. Okay, we don't go there because this is B2C, and today we talk just B2B. Okay, but as I said before, hybrid use cases where you have at the same time consumer and business user are increasingly frequent. But today we stick with the B side of the conversation. So let's go to business users, where before we're going into the various applications directly, maybe without a single sign-on, maybe with different accounts, and now they are provided with a seamless experience with multiple applications bound into a single view where they can pick the one they need to get to, and they are provided not just with single sign-on, but also with coarse-grained authorization should the target application require that. But where things are interesting is that what you provide in that unified view, here referred as my app, is controlled not by an administrator, but rather by another business user, which is provided with a dedicated view in terms of managing other people access. So is an experience built for business people around managing other business people and empowering potentially more delegates, not just more business users. So again, implementing a sort of chain of delegation, often referred as multi-level delegation. Just to complete the picture, there are some power users involved. We do consider the service desk, the service center reps power user because they can do usually more than what others can do, and of course the administrator. Okay, you see here a number of green boxes. This is a logical architecture. It doesn't mean that are different solutions, different components, are just the different constituents in terms of capability that are painting the entire picture. So just to provide you again more clarity around what diversity involves in representing those different kind of scenario, here I capture what is like to address consumer in the various brands and opposed to how is to address business user in that case, right? So you can see that there are differences on a per brand or a per user type in the way you register the user, which extra attributes are required. For instance, if I talk of insurance, a car insurance company, I need attributes that I don't need as a business user. I might offer social registration to consumer, not really to business users. And again, what is this formal authentication is also different. For instance, to business user, I require a second factor. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, and we talk business user, I will close my case study, digging a bit more in what is like the registration process. As I said before, this is very often the peak of diversity that we assist. So this is a busy slide with a busy picture, which of course I'm not going through. What I want like just to leave you with is that usually we need to use predefined sample of processes that we have, or to customize or to build new one. But in general, you always land into three aspects that need to be covered. There is an identification and consent initial part where you define who is the people the person you're dealing with and what they consent about. Then there is a validation of that identity and a profiling, and then the preparation for implementing some sort of second factor authentication when required. So let's zoom quickly in a bit more detail on the top part of it. In this case, it was very much about just capturing the email address of this business partner, now registering and getting his consent on document and on attribute. Email per se is a very shallow form of validation, but at times there are form of restriction of the email domain accepted to at least make it more valuable in terms of value of the attribute email address per se. But of course, it's not enough, right? We are talking business user who will never be giving access to somebody just because he has a valid email address. So in that case, there was a double validation. One, we're talking here of a Dutch company, so in that case, it was leveraged the banking industry EID, which is IDing, for those of you who are not familiar with, okay? So there was a branch out to IDing to validate the identity out of the email provided, okay? But then after that phase, there is second validation on the various attributes in a lookup of one of the legacy applications, because most of those business users had a relationship with the company before, so there were a bunch of attribute valuable for authorizations reasons that could be pulled from those applications. So there is a course entire identity validation and a per attribute validation that is the central part of this process before concluding the process and entering just one more detail, which is in this case the phone number, which should be validated to allow later two-factor authentication. In general, and then I'm getting to conclusion, what does it take to address B2B out of what I just described? Well, basically it takes 5 things. First, the ability to address flexibly the diversity of the registration and validation flows, as I just exemplified. Second, the possibility to manage consent, capture consent, coarse grain on document, fine grain on attribute, and to allow the user to withdraw and to amend what is their consent decision. Third, allow second factor authentication, maybe through SMS, maybe through mobile app, doesn't really matter. The key thing here is that second factor authentication here is relevant, not because we don't like password, that's not the point, is that in B2B otherwise we will likely have people sharing an account, which you don't want to have. That's why second factor authentication is relevant here. Number 4, that's where the delegation of authority kicks in. You need to have a flexible model to manage multiple layers of users with potentially at each layer a power user to create user at that level over level downstream, okay? With multiple types of restriction on which application and which application rights can be given at each and every level. So the conversation in number 4 can become fairly complex depending on the specific business need. Number 5 is around the rendering of everything I just described. Again, in B2B, way more than in B2C, there is an inclination of leveraging existing user interfaces without going API and building the UI. So of course, you need to have an easy enough to avoid otherwise overwhelming change management processes in the adoption from the business users. That being said, and getting to conclusion, addressing B2B basically is pretty much always an architectural conversation. It's not really a software selection. That's probably the most important lesson we gained over the last couple of years. Second, authority delegation and registration flow are where really the variations of customer requirement, but also on vendor offering capability are peaking. So that's where, if I was to give you my recommendation around where you should be giving an extra level of attention, those are probably the aspect that I would consider more relevant. Third, again, we're talking B2B. Of course, you want to have the ability to go API, and API first is very important. But talking B2B, I would definitely look for an API first, but maybe not an API only approach, meaning native UI and capability to optimize the time to market. And with that, Martin, I will give it back to you and would open up to questions.
Thank you, Marco. for this very insightful presentation. And so with that, we will directly switch to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions to Marco or to me, please enter them now in the questions area in the GoToWebinar control panel, which you usually find at the right side of your screen. We already have a couple of questions here, and I directly want to start with the first of these questions. And it fits, I think, to what you said just right at the end. Marco, you mentioned that a registration and validation process, or you talked about a registration validation process, and what you mentioned during your talk is that this can imply an integration with a CRM solution. So do you integrate Salesforce natively or others in that space?
Good question. That's a frequent one. Yeah. We do not claim to have a pre-can native adapter for Salesforce, although we integrated Salesforce multiple times already. Okay, so we can, when it comes to integration, we have an API first strategy. So each and every time we do integrate with what sort of CRM. Very often we call it CRM, but it's really a custom solution. It's not a vendor product that we need to integrate. So we integrate, I think, 2-3 times with Salesforce, but we never converted that into a productized adapter.
Okay.
Not yet, at least.
Yeah, thank you. Another question I see here, you said that there is always a service desk or customer care side involved. So
Right.
as many companies leverage solutions such as ServiceNow, do you integrate with these?
Oh, okay. That's okay. Another integration question. Yes, ServiceNow. Well, that's a very good question. Indeed, yeah, there is always a service desk involved, right? The bigger the company, of course, the more likely they already have some solutions such as ServiceNow to address that in a single way. And we do integrate with ServiceNow, meaning that bidirectional we can synchronize information into ServiceNow. But we are now looking at a different level of integration with that, meaning that what we are building, and this is in the making, we want to have a native plugin for ServiceNow. So to have the ServiceNow rendering, again, natively there, of what you can do on people's identity, okay? The common thing that you are required to do, such as reset a password, restart an activation process, change some attribute, change the consent attribute, that sort of thing will now be part of what you can enjoy. You can leverage directly from ServiceNow, okay? Again, this is a roadmap statement. It's not yet there, just to properly set expectation. But yes, it's very relevant, and we do consider that extremely important.
Okay, next one, what sort of skills and training are required for the business partners to learn how to manage other users?
Okay, yeah, that has to do with the change management usually involved in this sort of programs, right? Well, I have to say that well, that kind of links back to what I described it as a scenario. We usually contribute, and we are usually part of a broader program where an entire business application is being rebuilt, which is, again, very much what B2B is about. Opposed back into my workforce identity days, where there was very frequently the case that you add a new component, which is an identity management piece. I'm bringing that distinction up because in B2B, yes, you have now business users capability about managing other people. And of course, you need to teach them to your business user population. But at the same time, you will be also required to teach them as well the new application, the new business application, much bigger than just the identity piece that you're now introducing. What I'm saying with that is that very often the change management piece, due to the identity piece, got, let's say, is a tiny fraction of a much broader one, okay? So to that end, it is not very relevant in the overall deployment of such a solution.
One more question here. When we look at this GDPR topic you brought up, so how frequently do you see this being already on the radar of your customers? When you talk about B2B. So I think GDPR is pretty commonly on the radar when it comes to B2C. But is it already on the radar of the companies you talk with when you start talking about B2B use cases?
I would say we are early days. It's definitely each and every time part of what we get tasked to reply in RFI and RFP. That's always the case, no exception. That doesn't necessarily match with that being part of phase one of the adoption, rather the opposite. So phase one is very much around coarse grain consent on terms and condition. Not really, not yet. Very much around attribute level consent.
Okay. And then when we look at, so you've put a lot of focus on, I think this is really where the challenge is, the delegated management use cases, the self-registration use cases, stuff like that. How do you see in practice the balance of federating users, so business partner employees in versus the need for sort of managing them again? And maybe in addition, so which types of identity providers do you see a trend in the identity providers towards not self-managing these or relying on external identity providers, or is it really that you usually do it in your own business partner IDP, so to speak, commonly?
No, that's a good question, right? Again, when it comes to business partner, you have multiple needs. One of them is, of course, to identify them, and that could well be through federation, but the level of trust you need to have and the level of insurance you need to have on the identity pose a slightly different challenge. So to that end, in my example, for instance, I was talking not incidentally around the validation through ID, because that again removes what otherwise could be a less than ideally verified identity that we are now onboarding. Okay, so in terms of trend, we see that the various flavors of eIDAS in the various countries are more and more relevant. So it can be, of course, TransConnect, Speed in Italy, Gov UK, all of them. Okay, so that's definitely more and more coming. Okay, even in B2B scenario. Okay, because again, all of these people are in the citizen. Okay, and that's a trusted source. So and that's part of it, right? But as I was expressing in my example, there's a second dimension to that conversation, which is around what we know in terms of attributes which are relevant for the kind of authorization we want to give to those business partners. And that's where it's not just about identifying them, but it's about pulling information from other sources. I wouldn't call it that as an IDP integration. It's more of a lookup, okay? But it's very often the case that you have this dualism, this combination, okay? A trusted IDP, okay, and a lookup in some legacy system. So that's what we see. So federation per se is fine, but it's not enough. It's not completing the picture.
Okay, so with that, we're done with the questions we have received. Thank you to all the attendees for listening to this KuppingerCole webinar. Hope to have you soon at one of our upcoming events or webinars. Thank you, Marco, for all the insight you provided, and for iWelcome for supporting this webinar. And have a nice day.
Thank you very much.